So everybody, we're very lucky to have Robert Leshner of Compound here today at our DeFi Hackathon. For those of you who don't know, Compound is one of the industry-leading protocols, products, companies in the space. So we're very lucky to have this team here, both helping us out with projects and having their time to answer some questions here today. So yeah, we're going to jump straight in. So Robert, can you tell us a little bit about yourself? You have a pretty interesting background. We'd love to hear your story and how you came to start Compound.
Yeah, thank you. So I'll start by saying that I'm obsessed with DeFi. I'm obsessed with what you can build with it. And my journey to get here is not exactly traditional. So I started my career in finance, the old finance, the non-Coinbase, the non-DeFi finance, where the rules of how financial markets operate are extremely well known, and they're based on decades of iterative improvements. And I was always enthralled by that world. I was in the interest rate markets. I loved, the math side of this. I was a little bit of a bond geek. And from there, I actually wound up coming out to California and going into sort of your standard Silicon Valley software entrepreneurship. Building, on the traditional web stack and building products for consumers. And it wasn't until Ethereum started to take off that I said, holy cow, this is the best of all worlds. It's a chance to, apply novel financial concepts to applications that could theoretically touch, consumers across the world, that could reach billions of users. And, I was pretty much immediately enthralled once I realized how powerful the concepts of open finance were in terms of, what you could create. And, from there, I haven't looked back.
Amazing. So I guess before we jump into Compound specifically, what are the key differences that you've kind of experienced now between the traditional finance world and the tools within DeFi and the Ethereum ecosystem generally? What has it unlocked that's fascinating to you?
Well, it's unlocked a lot, and we're at a very early chapter still of what it can unlock and what it can do. So DeFi or open finance or programmable state on blockchains is extremely transformative for a couple different reasons. One, it's allowing anyone in the world to program pretty much any financial asset, program new financial assets. The ability to program money and assets is extremely powerful. And I think we're we've barely scratched the surface of what people have been able to accomplish so far. The fact that it's transparent is pretty radical as well. When you look at traditional financial markets, I was on Wall Street in 2007 and 2008 when things started to collapse because there wasn't a level of transparency. Nobody knew what counterparties held. Nobody knew how financial instruments were valued. There was an extreme amount of opacity, and that's a radical departure. The fact that it's open to anyone in the world, I see teams and developers and engineers and individuals building things from everywhere, from India, from South Korea, from the US, and working extremely collaboratively in a way that, right now, traditional finance feels extremely bordered. Oftentimes most countries have their own financial system that doesn't really expand too much outside of it. And the other thing that's really powerful about DeFi to me is the fact that it's composable. So, we hear this word a lot in DeFi. What does composable mean? It means that these systems can interact with each other. If I build something, at Compound and you build something, somewhere else in the ecosystem, a third party can then build an application that interacts with both of our products. And they don't need permission necessarily. They can just start building and composing these items. When in the old world, it takes years of business development and partnerships oftentimes to work with another financial product.
Fascinating. So you mentioned that in traditional finance, you often have these walled gardens, and it's very hard to have collaboration between these types of entities, and it's permissionless and global. I think what we've already seen with Compound is if you go to the homepage, there are many different independent businesses, projects, teams already building on top of Compound. And you often don't even know that's happened until they start gaining traction. So that seems like it's just something that is fundamentally different in this space. Can you talk about what that's been like and how that's been tracking?
Yeah, this is the best part about building in DeFi. You can build a component, a financial object, that gets used by other people. So, Ethereum is not the only platform for DeFi. I'll state that right out of the gate, but I'll just use Ethereum as an example. You can build a smart contract, which is a self-contained piece of business logic. And that self-contained piece of business logic, it's kind of like a library, right? Like, imagine if you're building an application, we like import tons of libraries as it is. With Ethereum, you can basically build a financial tool as a library that other applications can use. And so, we've built, essentially a library for interest rates. It's very simple. It allows people to capture an interest rate on popular Ethereum assets or to borrow one of those assets, and it can be embedded into other projects. And we've seen tons of projects building on top of Compound. And as I mentioned before, they don't need our permission, right? They can basically just, so to speak, start using this library right out of the gate. They don't have to cut a partnership with us. They don't have to do a business development deal. They can just start, integrating it. And so we, sometimes see projects just, announce that they've launched, having never spoken to us. And, sometimes they ask for our help in, building a project. But we've been blown away by the number of developers building on top of Compound.
Amazing. And I have two very simple questions. So, like, where does that interest rate come from, and how is it set?
Great question. So the interest rates in Compound are set by market forces, but we define the bounds of the market using an interest rate model created by the team. So the way it works is this, and I'll walk you through the process from the very beginning. So we define an interest rate model. It basically says that as demand to borrow an asset goes up, the interest rate goes up. It's pretty simple. It follows some very basic laws of financial physics. And it starts off with just that one rule. If demand goes up, interest rates go up. And we've been practicing this since day 0 of Compound. This was like the foundation of our white paper like 2 years ago. Was saying that you could use an algorithm to set the interest rates. And so we basically define just essentially 2 points. What's the interest rate if there's basically no borrowing demand for an asset? And what's the interest rate if there's extreme borrowing demand for the asset? And we basically have a curve or a line, connect those points. From there, it's up to the market. When people interact with Compound, they change the interest rates by changing supply and demand. So anytime that people come to the Compound protocol and they start borrowing assets from it, interest rates go up a little bit. If people start supplying more liquidity to the protocol, interest rates go down just a little bit. And the market is able to find an equilibrium really without any intervention at all from our team. So even though interest rates are changing constantly by the second, it's not because we're pulling a lever, it's because the market is working. And you compare and contrast that to how interest rates are generally set in the US as an example. I mean, the Federal Reserve sets rates essentially every 3 months, right? And in between that point, you basically are pegged to that rate. We basically see rate changes on a second-by-second basis, which is really cool to watch.
Super interesting. And because of the core characteristics of it being both transparent and programmable, anyone can come in and inspect the entire state of the network and infer and verify what the rate should be at any given point in time, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So you can go and download from the blockchain every single transaction that's ever occurred. You can determine the state at any point in time. You can inspect every input, every parameter, every formula, every model. Everything is 100% completely transparent and auditable. And that's really cool. It means that you can, develop on top of it more easily. You can just, run a copy locally. You can interact with it. You can watch it change. And you can actually come up with improvements to the protocol. It's possible that a user might be able to say, oh, based on all of this data that we now have, something should be different.
Now, when you moved from version 1 of Compound to version 2 in May of this year, you introduced the concept of a tokenized balance in the form of the C token. Can you tell us a little bit more about what the C token is, what the thinking was behind that, and what that's meant for adoption of the protocol since then?
Yeah, that's a great question. So when we launched Compound, we launched the first version without really knowing what to expect. The first version of Compound was designed to test a lot of our hypotheses. And developing for Ethereum or developing on-chain is very different than developing for a traditional web software stack. Upgradability is far less, it's far slower, it's much more like versioned hardware in a lot of ways. And so rather than trying to hypothesize what the perfect version of this platform would be, we said, let's just get out a version that we think is ideal. And that was Compound version 1. Compound version 1 looks and feels a lot like Compound today. There's algorithmic interest rates that are set based on a model, taking into account supply and demand. There's pooled liquidity. There's the concept of being able to borrow an asset using your other balances as collateral. It looks and feels a lot like what exists today. We're the first ones to ship pretty much any of these features. At this point, a lot of the work we did has become sort of, at this point, common knowledge that a lot of other teams have learned from. But at the time, we just wanted to ship a very simple implementation. And so, we were able to watch it work in the market. We were able to see, users come in. When we launched, there was a couple $1 million of liquidity, and by the end of Compound V1, there was about $20 million of liquidity. But we knew that we could do better. And so we had been designing Compound version 2, which took into account the lessons learned from having an application live on-chain being used by real users. We had to observe it for probably 4 months before we even knew what changes we wanted to make. It's a very different software development cycle than you might see at somewhere like Coinbase. And so we took some of the lessons we learned and we said, okay, what would increase the ability of developers to build on top of Compound? And one of the biggest insights that we had was tokenizing the balances. So in Compound version 1, it was extremely simple. There was a market, which is basically a contract. And you transfer tokens into the market, and you earned interest while they were in the market, and you could withdraw them. And you could borrow from that market, and that was it. In Compound V2, we said, okay, what if the balances inside the market were transferable? Now, a normal user doesn't really care. It's not that important, for your standard run-of-the-mill user to be able to transfer a balance in the market. But if you're building an application on top of the protocol, it increases the use cases by 10x. And the reason is you can have an application that can manipulate balances of assets that are earning interest, as opposed to saying oh, I first have to withdraw the asset, and then I have to convert it again. It reduces a lot of steps and a lot of frictions. And so it opens up use cases for more easily integrating with things like custodial systems. It integrates with wallets more easily. It really changes how developers are able to perceive the protocol and interact with it. And so for us, just being able to do something as simple as moving a balance of an asset that's inside the protocol, it means you can move an interest-earning asset as opposed to just moving an underlying token. And that's been really big. I mean, that's kicked off most of the development activity.
Yeah, it's been fascinating to see tokens like CDAI or CUSDC, some of the traction those tokens themselves have been gaining on Uniswap Exchange or other exchanges, just because it is genuinely another asset that you can interact with. So it's very common for, instead of people to directly deposit funds into Compound to start earning interest, they simply just buy a C token off an exchange and they're immediately accruing interest that way.
Yeah, it allows people to have entirely new experiences. We never thought someone would want to buy a Compound balance. In fact, it still surprises us, but it also allows you to sell a Compound balance. It actually is going to unlock all sorts of new use cases like insurance and derivatives on Compound balances, which are actually going to add a lot of stability and predictability, which we're excited about.
Awesome. And you mentioned 2 things previously, that upgradability and the software development lifecycle for Compound is very different to what you see at a typical software company. Can you talk a little bit about that? And have there been any learnings from finance and product that you've had previously that's kind of informed those? Can you talk to that a little bit?
Yeah, so Compound moves by design extremely slowly. We're trying to write, correct code, which means we're trying to ship code that is reliable from day zero. We don't really have the ability to patch bugs very easily, so we have to assume that there's almost no ability to patch bugs, which leads to a very scary software development cycle. In traditional financial markets, you can reverse a transaction. If you accidentally fat finger, and this happens now and then, if you fat finger $1 billion to the wrong counterparty, you will get it back, right? I could wire, Jacob $1 billion, and it's not that big of a deal. We can reverse the transaction. In crypto, obviously, you can't reverse the transaction. If I sent, Jacob $1 billion of C tokens, I would have to beg him
I mean, we should try this out. I'm happy to, we can prove this hypothesis or not.
Yeah, you know, we don't have that much capital. Coinbase might be able to send you $1 billion, but I know Compound can't, so. But it leads to a very different development cycle. So, you know, every line of code has to be reviewed multiple times from our team. We spend a lot of time, and our cycle is actually really interesting. We basically, you know, ideate, design, spec, build, audit, test, release, with a couple other sort of little steps in there. And we try to write things once. And so, you know, instead of having like an iterative process where we're constantly, you know, building, like we think of things in terms of releases, and like our releases are few and far between. And, you know, since starting the company 2 years ago, I feel like we've shipped code 5 times. It's a very small, you know, frequency. And it's the first time we've ever had to go through this sort of process. It feels a lot like hardware when I talk to founders who have built hardware projects.
Fascinating. So like, what's it like, you know, say you get customer feedback 2 weeks before a release, it's actually a genius idea, or it's something that would unlock a lot of like potential functionality. Like, how would you treat a situation like that?
So that's a great question. We basically say that's a great idea, we're gonna have to wait. You know, on the interface side, like if you build like, you know, a web interface to a protocol, there's a lot you can do. You can just throw changes out there right away. And there have been times where, you know, we do have a single web interface to interact with the protocol. You can always go to the protocol yourself, interact with the smart contracts, but, you know, most users don't want that. So we do have a web interface. There, we're able to change things extremely rapidly, but oftentimes we basically have to wait. You know, we tell users, hey, that's a great idea. We might get to it in Compound V2, we might not.
So as you look to, so you're at V2 now, as you look to V3, what are the focus areas right now? And what are the challenges or upgrades you're looking to make? And what's like the opportunities you see for the kind of the next phase of Compound?
So the biggest thing that we're gonna be doing going forward is we're gonna be focusing on decentralizing the administration of the protocol. And we've been sort of like, you know, banging on this drum since day 0 of Compound. Like we are always saying that we want to move into a more decentralized direction because it's safer, it's more predictable, and it's more stable. And you know, right now, like our team is responsible for setting the interest rate model for a market. We don't change them very frequently, but theoretically, we're not the best equipped people to set the interest rate model. You know, theoretically, the aggregate of the community and all the sort of pooled global knowledge that exists outside of our team is best equipped to, you know, set some of these parameters. And so for us, we actually see a lot of value in us no longer having really any control or influence over the protocol. We want the community to be able to upgrade the protocol. We want the community to be able to make modifications to it and to handle the very small amounts of sort of like administration that occur. And in our mind, this is going to allow the protocol to sort of outlive all of us. You know, we actually don't want to be in charge of this thing, like, because it's hard to have a protocol that will last for longer than our careers. But we want Compound to be infrastructure that survives for 100 years, right, or 200 years, or 1,000 years, or past, you know, human evolution. And so in order to do that, we actually have to, you know, make the extremely difficult decision to hand off control outside of our own company.
Fascinating. So success for the Compound team could be that the Compound team itself no longer exists and the interface you built today is no longer needed?
Well, the interface we built today, ironically, is no longer needed. So, you know, this is sort of like a crypto product development, you know, insight. But, you know, in order to bootstrap liquidity early on, we needed our own interface. Before we could, you know, demonstrate to other developers that they should build on top of Compound, there had to be a base of liquidity and usage in the protocol. So we shipped Compound with our own interface. We shipped the protocol that was running on the blockchain, and we shipped a website on top of it. And that was required to sort of solve this like chicken the egg problem of initial liquidity. But once the liquidity is there, our interface is no longer necessary. At this point, you can access, you know, the Compound protocol, not the website, but the protocol from all sorts of interfaces, from Dharma, from Instadap, from all these different, you know, developers that are built on top of the protocol. At this point, we can actually take down the website entirely, and Compound will continue to exist and to work. You might not have pretty dashboards to have like insight into the markets. You might have to go to the blockchain to like read the data. But Compound, the website, could go away entirely. We could kill every server we have. And Compound would continue to function pretty much exactly the same way. And that's really cool.
Wow. So that's super different. So like, interesting. So for you then, like, how do you think about, you mentioned liquidity. Where is that like liquidity coming from? How have you seen it grow over time? And what have been the like novel use cases that you're starting to see like build around this like liquidity pool within Compound?
So we've been surprised as we've watched it grow. And this goes back to, shipping the first version, what did we expect? We actually didn't have stablecoins at all in Compound V1 initially, because we didn't think that stablecoins were going to be sort of like the killer use case of Compound. When we initially shipped Compound, it was just Ether and a number of tokens. And we've been surprised that most of the use cases that people have been, creating have centered around stablecoins, because it makes a lot of sense. If you're going to borrow an asset, you want to borrow a stable asset because you want a predictable liability. If you're going to earn a couple % of interest, that's not that exciting on an asset that's hyper volatile and is going up or down, 20% in a month. But on a stable asset like a stablecoin, a couple % winds up being an extremely attractive asset. And so the use cases that we've seen pretty much all center around stablecoins for right now, and that will change, potentially. But for right now, it's mostly centered around stablecoins, and it really varies by the customer segment. So there's people that are supplying assets to the protocol, and there are people that are borrowing assets from the protocol. On the supply side, it's pretty intuitive. Anyone who wants to earn a return on a balance is using the protocol. We're seeing wallets form that are moving assets from the real world, so to speak, into the protocol. We're seeing a lot of use cases around earning an idle return for assets that are otherwise just cash. A number of crypto hedge funds and a number of sophisticated individuals are using it for that. On the borrowing side, it's really two main use cases, but we're seeing like hints of lots of other use cases. So the two largest use cases are, we're seeing some miners that instead of selling Ether are basically mining Ether, sending it into Compound and using it to borrow stablecoins, pretty much programmatically. And using that to pay their bills, buy more hardware, whatever they normally do. And we're seeing traders and sophisticated firms borrowing stablecoins from Compound for portfolio management, investment ideas. We're also seeing people use it to we're seeing crypto teams using their crypto as collateral to take out stablecoins to pay their developers around the world instead of selling off their assets. We've definitely seen that. It's less frequent, but usually they're really excited when they do this and they, talk about how they're paying their people with stablecoins that they could just borrow using their team's tokens. And we're seeing lots of other, smaller use cases. But the most creativity right now is actually happening on the supply side, which is we're seeing dozens of applications emerge to take advantage of the concept that an idle asset can be put to work.
Awesome. And like one of the key value props, I guess, of Compound is that this interest is essentially accruing in real time, or at least block to block and compounding block to block. What have you seen in terms of developer activity around the interest itself?
So we've seen some really cool things around the interest itself. In the traditional world, financial markets operate in a unit of time of days. If you have money at 5 p.m., that money is yours until essentially, the next day. And all interest is calculated by the day, really. There's no concept of time sub 1 day. With a blockchain, you can shatter that expectation. And so, interest can accrue for 15 seconds or in 15-second increments. And so theoretically, you can, manipulate the interest on a balance within a day. You could build an application that handles the float of an asset for an hour. Or you could have an application that, even if you're only holding assets or liquidity for minutes, that's a revenue stream, which is really kind of mind-boggling in a lot of ways. And you could build applications around that. And so, what's really cool about this is all of a sudden new use cases are possible as you can sort of program the interest on assets. We're seeing things like, there's a project that shipped on Compound called Pool Together. It's basically a no-loss lottery, as they say, where they basically deposit an asset in the Compound. The interest that's generated on that asset is then randomly assigned to a user, and everyone gets their money back. We're seeing people manipulate the interest as a stream or an object, which is really cool. And I think there's a lot more creative use cases that are coming.
Amazing. So I'm going to tie this to Coinbase now. So as we're obviously experimenting with the hackathon in DeFi, massive excitement about the space generally. how would you recommend Coinbase starts to like integrate with Compound, view Compound generally, and then how could Coinbase contribute to the DeFi ecosystem at large?
So there's a lot that Coinbase can do in the DeFi ecosystem at large, and I think there's always going to be a gap between the first people to experiment with new protocols, new assets, new systems, and when it goes completely mainstream. In a lot of ways, Coinbase sits in the middle. In some ways, it's really like a leading indicator for the world, but in some ways, it also gets the benefit of seeing what's working and how it works and how to integrate it once it's working. And so there's a lot that I'm excited about happening right here within Coinbase. I think there's opportunities on the commerce side. People are looking to pay merchants and for merchants to handle the flow of finances. When you start dealing with stable coins and you start having interest rates on those stable coins, you can very quickly get to the concept of having essentially bank accounts for merchants that are actually usable across the board. I think there's opportunities on just the assets held inside of Coinbase for consumers eventually, where for sophisticated consumers that are able to be educated in some way to opt in to participating in a DeFi platform like Compound. I think Coinbase could obfuscate some of the complexity of that because right now interacting with these protocols is extremely manual. It's extremely cumbersome. It's not always designed for individual users. And Coinbase could bridge that very easily. Millions of users. You can productize some of the complexity away. I think there's opportunities for the custody side of Coinbase to begin, building bridges to DeFi for sophisticated users that want to opt into it. I think there's a lot of pent-up demand where, institutions and larger firms and crypto firms know what this stuff is, but don't have tools to access it yet. Every tool so far is really focused on retail still, for the most part. And so us individuals get to play around with this cool stuff, but institutions don't. And I think there's ways to sort of help the ecosystem grow. There's a project being worked on during this hackathon to build a better price feed on chain of Coinbase prices that could have massive ramifications for DeFi. To have another data source that DeFi platforms like Compound could use. And so I'm just excited to see what Coinbase creates. I think we're all working towards the same vision. Coinbase's vision has always been to build an open financial system that includes everybody. And DeFi is probably like the killer use case of this. It really is like the most mission fit that I've ever seen. Yes, like Bitcoin is inclusive, right? But DeFi is an opportunity to build like financial infrastructure that truly like spans the world and is open to everybody and starts to change how we interact with financial markets. And so I'm just excited to see Coinbase begin to embrace DeFi. I think it has probably 100 times the upside for where crypto markets are going. And so, I'm just really excited to see what gets created.
Amazing. So over the next 10 years, or 10 or 100 years, like you mentioned, what's the grand vision for Compound? If we're looking back from then to now, what's the sequence of events that you think should happen, and what does that mean for the world?
Yeah, so what we want is for Compound to just be sort of shared infrastructure that people can trust, people can understand, people can reason about, and people can build on. And we want Compound to exist forever. And so for us, all of our vision from here is building Compound into being the most reliable platform, period. Everything we do, it's not about new features, new functionality. It's about resiliency, so that it can be something that every application can use by default. So that comes down to governance. It comes down to making what I like to call this meteor proof. I like to envision a meteor comes down and just annihilates our entire company, and Compound works perfectly. It's about making it meteor proof, and it's about allowing the community to take what we've started and run with it. Our vision for this is that eventually, the folks here within Coinbase can upgrade Compound and change how it works. And there's a path to do so. And when we achieve all of that, I think that's when, we can begin to exhale and step back and say, all right, this is what we've built.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for coming in. We'd love to open up any questions to the audience.
So in traditional finance, a lot of volume is driven by products of financial engineering, where the price is not easily observable and requires high volume of calculation to determine, like interest rate swaps or any other sort of like leveraged instruments. How do you see this in DeFi? Because like currently the prices are easily observable using oracles and you can do liquidations and all this stuff. But what about like over-the-counter derivatives that sort of you need to calculate the price of?
Yeah, that's a great question. Because it's, and this is really abstract, but it's a shared ledger. It's one set of books and records that anyone in the world can basically agree with, as opposed to everyone having their own ledger of what they think a transaction is. When you do anything OTC, I have my own ledger, you have your own ledger, and I hope to God we agree on prices, on value, on all these things. The best part about DeFi is there's a single source of truth that everyone can interact with. And so eventually I don't think there is necessarily like, this idea of like OTC and differences of opinion over like valuation. I think eventually everything is going to be on chain in some form, whether it's just for the settlement, whether it's just for pricing, et cetera. But that's going to be a very long journey. And I don't have a crystal ball on exactly how it's going to play out.
Hello? Oh, there we go. I'm curious how you view competition within like protocols and between protocols on this space. I know it's like everyone's talking about like the massive growth of a lot of competing protocols, and early on it makes sense for a lot of people to be doing land grabs. And I know that Compound is in the middle of all this with all these different lending protocols, and I'm just curious what your take on that is.
Yeah, so I think it's still, and I love saying that it's too early, but like in a lot of ways it's still extremely early to know whether or not there will be multiple protocols, or whether there will be one, or whether like how these will work together. Like I can see a lot of different outcomes emerging, and I think it's still too early to even know can they be complementary or can they be competitive. Like I don't have a good answer as the founder of Compound whether they're complementary or competitive because it's so early and we've yet to see. Like there's many scenarios where you flip a switch and all of a sudden it's like, oh, they all magnify each other's usefulness, right? So at this point, like I think we'll have to wait 2 years to begin to answer that question.
Hey, is Compound married to the Ethereum blockchain, or is there a world where it moves to any other EVM compatible chain?
So we are not technically married to Ethereum, but right now there's not that much portability between Ethereum and other blockchains. I'm really excited by projects that are able to tie blockchains together, whether it's through atomic swaps or the portability of state in some fashion. But right now we're an island, but we're not going to be an island forever. I think eventually as Compound becomes more upgradable by the community, and stay tuned for the plans for how this becomes upgradable by the community over the next year or so. But as it becomes upgradable by the community, I think there's a high likelihood that other teams out there eventually begin to bridge Compound with other blockchains, with Cosmos, with Polkadot, et cetera. But it's going to be a slow process. Nothing in crypto happens quickly. But theoretically, Compound can start to extend beyond the walls of Ethereum.
I have one last question for you. So for the people here or the people watching this video, like what are the products you'd want to see people build on top of Compound that have not been built yet?
That's a great question. There's so much. I actually don't want to limit people's creativity by like throwing ideas out there because like in some ways the opportunity space is like unbounded. You can build almost anything. It's like what can you do with an interest rate, for assets? What can you do if there's an interest rate for money that you can't do right now? It's a huge opportunity space. Personally, I'm really excited about tying this opportunity more closely to custody. I think there's a lot of people who have a lot of assets that are idle, and Compound really puts idle assets to work. Outside of that, I think it's really interesting in the payment side. Money in transit, being able to earn interest for a short amount of time is a business model that hasn't really been explored. I think over time, as Compound supports stablecoins in multiple currencies, you can start to get into really interesting opportunities with international trade. But in a lot of ways, it's still extremely early. So, I think we're going to see creativity sort of flourish over the next couple of years.
Amazing. Okay, thank you, Robert, for your time. Appreciate you and the Compound team being here, and yeah, thank you again.
Thanks, Jacob.